Good morning. My name is Mark Durant. I'm an ethnographer based in Cambridge and a colleague of Alan and several people in the room. If you didn't already know this, Alan is not only exceptionally generous, but in a former life he was a fighter jet pilot, which he doesn't talk about a lot, but I think it does speak to his character. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you a former colleague of ours, Sunita Sah. She was a judge. She's now a professor of management at Cornell University. Originally trained as a medical doctor, Sunita wrote a series of essays on conflicts of interest in medicine for her PhD, and has since also developed an interest in issues of transparency and why it is that you and I find it so hard to reject bad advice. Sunita, over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here today. We have a panel of two people who I'm excited to introduce. So first of all, we have Diane Benscoter, who is the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Antidote. And we also have, I believe, Sander van der Linden, a social psychologist at Cambridge University here. Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So it's a pleasure to be here, to meet both of you and have this conversation with you. So it will just be a conversation, and later on we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But I want to dive straight in here and ask a much broader question, really inspired by the first talk, as to the age that we're living in now of we're talking so much about disinformation. Is this something new in the last 10 years, or is it that we're just more aware of disinformation now, and due to the work that both of you are doing, actually looking at ways to tackle disinformation? So, from both of you.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think, as a previous speaker mentioned, I do think disinformation obviously has been around a lot. In my book, I talk about the Infowars of Rome and how Augustus and Mark Antony used classic propaganda tactics. And so I think some of these tactics are thousands of years old, but I do think that social media has fundamentally reshaped the flow of information in society. Obviously, the velocity with which it can travel, how many people we can reach, and I always say, clearly, exposure doesn't equal infection, but certainly we have a lot more exposure to disinformation. It's coming at us from multiple angles. It's not just your cranky uncle or your funny cousin. It's WhatsApp, TikTok, YouTube, Google, cable TV, newspapers, websites, your friends. And so I think we have a lot more venues for disinformation to spread, for bad actors to leverage it, and to maximize the probability that it's going to influence someone who is going to be receptive to both the combination of the medium and the message. And I think there are new ways to leverage that. I mean, we haven't even talked about AI yet, which can obviously automate the production of disinformation. In some ways, AI is democratizing the disinformation market. Before, you had to be clever like Stephen and spend your career trying to craft propaganda. Now, OpenAI can do it for you much faster. Research shows that actually when you train it on human-written propaganda, the algorithm's propaganda is viewed as more persuasive, at least a little bit, by people, because it's more succinct than humans, it's shorter, it's punchier. And so I think there are all these interesting aspects about our current environment that make things potentially a lot worse.
Thank you.
I would add to that I think disinformation is a tool of psychological manipulation.
Sure.
And so I think that it's always been around as a tactic, and in my experience of working with people who are in extremist groups and religious cults and such, disinformation is always a part of the agenda. But what I think that the lens that we need to look at is psychological manipulation, because how does it land? How does this disinformation land? And if there's psychological vulnerability, if people have psychological vulnerability to the messaging that's coming through there, and it feeds them and it makes them feel better and it creates an information silo, then that's why it's so dangerous, because it's just a tool of psychological manipulation. And I really think it's important for us to widen our lens and not just look at disinformation. It's really just a vehicle. What's really important is it working to manipulate people on a psychological level and control what they believe is true? Does it create an environment where they can't think that anyone else is telling the truth? There's an us and a them, so it creates that us polarization, and it creates an environment where you can only trust this source. You have institutions that are typically trustworthy have become untrustworthy. That's the reason. That's what's in the disinformation. It's messaging that controls people on a psychological level. That's what we really need to focus on, I believe.
Yeah, and there's a lot there, and I want to come back to the trust aspect, but Diane, I'm really interested in how you came to be involved in this work. Would you tell us a little bit more about your experience? And you were part of a cult, how you got really sucked into that cult in a way, and how you got out of it.
Thank you. Yes. So at 17, I was highly vulnerable. I was idealistic. The Vietnam War was going on. And I grew up in a tiny little town in Nebraska, and I really wanted to find something bigger. I really believed that there was an important thing to do that was more important than education, more important than anything else. And so I came into contact with an environment where tactics of manipulation were present. It was the Moonies. It happened to be the Unification Church, commonly known as the Moonies. And those two things came together, my vulnerability and this environment where those tactics were present. And so I became a devoted member of the Unification Church. I would have done anything for my Messiah. I would have died. I hoped that I wouldn't have hurt anyone. But I really believed that he was the second coming of Christ. I went from a lost young person to a disciple of Christ, which is a really big promotion. And so I was in there for 5 years, and it was very painful for my loved ones, and especially my mother. And then I was deprogrammed. My family had me deprogrammed, and in those days there was kind of an underground railroad, and people were being pulled out of religious cults through this underground railroad where ex-members the family would trick the person into being in a house. It was an intervention of sorts. And so that worked. And what worked wasn't necessarily debunking the information. What really worked was understanding the manipulation, understanding Robert Lifton's work on thought reform and the psychology of totalism, the understanding that I had been taken advantage of on a psychological level, that the best part of me had been taken advantage of. And so I left, and I got a job working in a rehab house for people leaving cults, and then I became a deprogrammer. I started going out on cases. I did that for about 5 years, and ultimately I was arrested for kidnapping. It was expunged from my record. I did a plea bargain. But then throughout my life, I realized people came to me for help from different places, and I realized that this needed a bigger solution. We needed a public health level solution ultimately to this, because it didn't matter what the belief system is. It didn't really matter what people believed. What mattered was that human beings are vulnerable to being taken advantage of on a psychological level. Their needs are met. It really doesn't matter what the lie is. What matters is that it feeds you. It makes you feel exceptional when you're in this information silo, and you only believe what's in that little community of people, and you feel better when you're in that community. So debunking it isn't going to help. What helps is realizing your agency was taken away from you. What helps is realizing that trickery was done on you, and that's what we need to do on a wide range.
And how quickly did you realize when, I think it was your relatives, your parents maybe intervened, and okay, so debunking, you're saying, doesn't work, right? So if somebody
believes...
It's
part of it, but it's not that important.
You can't go to them with rational facts. What actually worked for you? What was said to you that made you think a little bit more about what was going on and ultimately changed your belief?
What worked for me was the deprogrammer that was talking to me brought out Robert Lifton's book, Thought Reform and Psychology of Totalism, and read a chapter out of that that defined what an environment is that is using tactics. He called it brainwashing or thought reform. I call it psychological manipulation. But in each of those 8 points that he defined as being in an environment where that is intentionally taking place, I saw every one of them in my environment, and there was this little voice in the back of my head that started out as a whisper, what if this whole thing was a lie? And it got louder and louder, and there was a point where I couldn't, it just became so clear to me, I was screaming, it was all a lie. And it was devastating moment in my life. I actually thought I heard glass breaking around me. It was so shattering. And it took a long time to recover. It's not easy to recover from having your identity stolen from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Sandra, how does your work relate to Diane's experience? I'd love to know a little bit more about how you got involved in it too, what interested you in this, and the parallels with what you're finding in your research.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels. I mean, I would 100% agree that disinformation is about psychological manipulation. So, most of the research that our group does in this area is about helping people identify what psychological manipulation looks like and what the building blocks of those strategies are that are used on people so that people can arm themselves and resist it when they encounter it. So, I'd fully agree with that. Generally, when I started, I was initially fascinated by some of the techniques that were used to produce misinformation about climate change. Something very interesting occurred to me after reading some of the work from Naomi Oreskes, who's a science historian at Harvard, who was documenting some of the same tactics that have been recycled over time by the tobacco industry, by the oil industry, to cast doubt on science, for example, to use what are called fake experts, dress people up in a white coat and have them advertise something that has nothing to do with their expertise. And I got intrigued by trying to see what are the techniques that are used to spread disinformation more generally, and can we then inoculate people against those techniques? And so I like the antidote sort of framing, because in a way it sort of signals that we do need either an effective therapeutic treatment for people who have already been radicalized, or a vaccine for people who are about to be targeted by manipulation. And so that's what we spend a lot of time doing. And debunking not being effective, I think debunking doesn't really work on people who are part of a cult. I think, and maybe I'll share a dad joke with the audience about, I think, the psychology of conspiracy theories. There's this chap, a conspiracy theorist, who dies and goes to heaven, and God, him or herself, is waiting at the pearly gates, and this conspiracy theorist says, "Look, God, I gotta ask you, was COVID a hoax? I mean, I really don't buy it." And so God sort of thinks and says, and says, no, COVID was real, and vaccines saved millions of lives. And the conspiracy theorist goes, damn, this thing goes much higher up than I thought. And that is really the essence of what it's like to be in the worldview of somebody who is convinced so deeply that there's really no way out other than to reject the evidence that's in front of their eyes. So Leon Festinger was a social psychologist who, by modern-day standards, this wouldn't count as a scientific experiment, but he infiltrated a cult who believed in a UFO apocalypse story in the 50s, and they had this sort of doomsday prediction that this flood was going to come, but then a flying saucer would take them all away, and he infiltrated this cult to observe, to see what would happen to people's beliefs when the apocalypse wouldn't happen, because that was the hypothesis, that the apocalypse. So they waited in this house in the suburb of Chicago until the day came, no apocalypse. And what he observed was that people whose beliefs were not so strongly committed decided that this wasn't worth their time, and they kind of left the cult. But people who were really invested socially and whose identity has become part of this group, they double down on their belief. They come up with rationalizations to say, well, it's going to be later, we miscalculated the date. So they move up a level, and that's what the sort of self-sustaining worldview is, that when you become trapped in sort of conspiracy theories, the same happens, that you become trapped in this sort of self-sealing worldview. Not sure if that resonates with your experience, but that you basically reject the evidence and you commit further to the beliefs you already have, and you come up with rationalizations and excuses for why the evidence doesn't fit, because of this concept of cognitive dissonance. People don't like to be confronted with information that contradicts what they want to be true about the world, and so you could either change your beliefs, right, or change reality, or change reality in some way, and that's or at least how we perceive reality, and so that's often what happens.
Yeah, I think that's true, exactly, and I think that, which is why we have to widen the lens.
Yeah.
And look at this as, what are the tactics of manipulation that are in place? What is the messaging that's going out, and why? What is trying to be accomplished? And if it's polarization, and if it's to create an information silo, and if it's to create dependency on the information source, then those who are more vulnerable, who have more of a need for it to be true, it's become their identity, will cling to it harder. And they aren't interested in arguing about facts. They have thought-terminating cliches that they will repeat over and over again to just dismiss everything, like the guy at the pearly gates.
Yeah.
So
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they don't care. They just assume that it's wrong. They've already bought into the idea that you can't trust the major institutions. You can't trust educational institutions, medical institutions, politics, government at all. And so when you take away all the smartest people as untrustworthy, then you just feed them the information over and over and make them feel more and more dependent on this for their identities. And so what we have to do is take a public health approach to this problem by working in the 3 pillars of helping those people that are already affected. There's like 1,000 people in our database at Antidote that they're all loved ones that come. The person who is in the information silo, if you will, they're not coming and knocking on our door saying, deprogram me. Not at all. It's the loved ones who see the change in the person that they care about, and they don't know what to do, and they try to argue facts, and they try to get them to think rationally or use critical thinking, right. And it just doesn't help.
So it comes down to what information can we trust, and thinking about the source of the information itself. How do we know who to trust? Should it be that we all trust medical institutions, that we all trust governments? Can you talk a little bit about how you view disinformation and where people are turning to for this type of information, and who they trust and who they don't trust, and why?
I think that there's a lot of people who are really lost, and they don't know who to trust, and they are angry, and they are scared. And so it's a relief for them to feel like they found something that they think, okay, here's the truth. And I think that's why it's so potent. And psychological manipulation is self-perpetuating. As soon as you are infected, if you will, then you try to pull others in. You really want to pull your loved ones in. You want to pull anyone else in because you really believe that this is the answer and that this is the truth. I'm working with some people who were at the insurrection. They're in jail now, and they're good people who love their families and love the country. And they just really came to believe that they were fighting for what was good in the world.
Right.
And that's the problem. And so, but I think what gives me hope is that people they have an invested interest in maintaining their agency. And so no one wants to be an ex-cult member. No one wants to have to admit that they were taken advantage of on that level. And so if we can help people understand the trickery behind the disinformation, I think that's what can really help. So we have to create in that pillar of public policy, and there's a lot of, and creating guardrails around social media, for instance, or looking at legal issues of consent. Is it consent if you're psychologically manipulated? You know, those people in jail, did they do this on their own, or is psychological manipulation part of what caused them to do this?
Right.
And so, of course, the big pillar is education. How do we educate people about this threat? How do we help people understand what's at risk here?
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about solutions? Do you agree with Diane on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of the public health approach, that we need to treat the people who are radicalized. We need a huge preventative pillar, which I think is currently lacking, and it's one of the most, it's important to have a first line of defense, I think. And then, some people will say, oh, but, most people are not in cults, so, let's not be too hasty about this problem. But I think when you follow the public health approach, it becomes clear that you only need one patient zero to start spreading a virus. Right? Think of QAnon. I mean, it started out small, then it grows, and then people are storming the Capitol. Think about people intentionally spreading rumors on WhatsApp to cause intergroup violence. Think about micro-targeting people during elections. So I do think that even though most people are perhaps not radicalized by disinformation, it's a very serious problem that, when deployed strategically, can really undermine democracy. And so I do think we need to focus on the cues of manipulation. So what we do in our research is, to get to your question about sources, we focus more on the presence or absence of these manipulation tactics, and we try to help people identify them. So we don't tell them what sources they need to trust, but whether or not these techniques are present. And so you get into a slightly different sort of story. So to give you an example, polarization is one of these tactics, to create headlines that deliberately polarize liberals, conservatives, pro and con on issues, right? Conspiracy theories is one of the techniques, which is not what most people think. Usually you have to use a grain of truth, a real issue, otherwise your conspiracy gets no traction, right? And so it has to sound plausible, not like birds aren't real. Are people familiar with birds aren't real? That's the government drones. Why do they sit on power lines to recharge? And so but I think there's actually major error in the birds aren't real conspiracy. If I would have done it, I would have said some birds aren't real, because then you can go into the ones with the spots and the beak, and then it becomes this whole sort of sub-community. So that's important. Trolling, during elections, discrediting people using denial and deflection tactics, the use of fear-mongering, so emotions, to try to play on people's emotions usually with fear and outrage. And logical fallacies, like extremists often use things like false dilemmas. You're either with me or you're against me in their attempts to radicalize people. And so what we do is we follow the inoculation analogy by exposing people actually to weakened doses or simulations of what it's like to be confronted with these attacks, so that people, and then refute them in advance. That's the crucial part. You refute it in advance, and you deconstruct it for people, so people can build up cognitive immunity or resistance, perhaps is a better term, because we're never going to be immune, perhaps, but people can become more resistant, I think. And that's really what we do. But then, it's interesting, because some people will say, okay, but what if trusted sources use manipulation techniques on people? And my answer to that is, it is probably not a bad thing for people to be aware of these manipulation techniques, even when trusted sources. You know, the BBC had an issue with propping up climate contrarians for a long time. The difference with non-credible outlets is that they apologize, they correct because they have editorial practices in place, and they are no longer doing that. But when the BBC presents people with climate contrarians, that's potentially more damaging than some outlet nobody cares about, right? The New York Times printed headlines about weapons of mass destruction during the Iraq War, which were never found. It was quite harmful. They apologized, they corrected, but it's certainly not the case that trusted outlets never produce manipulative headlines. So I think the better strategy is to help people identify those manipulation strategies rather than force people to say this source is reliable and this source is not.
Yes, I agree with that completely. Yeah, that's really important.
And in terms of trusted, continuing along this line, what are the individual differences and even communities? So, for example, communities of color may not trust medical institutions as much as other people for legitimate reasons, you know, past traumas, abuse. And with the COVID vaccine, for example, many communities thought that they weren't represented in clinical trials. And so there's actually a lack of evidence for some groups. How does your work or your thinking along these lines, how would you address that?
Yeah, great question. I think that it's so important to speak in the language that people can hear and can understand. So if the agenda is to help people understand psychological manipulation, then you have to work with community leaders, you have to work with faith leaders, you have to work with trusted voices, and you have to use the stories of former people that were tricked in this way within those communities to try to help people understand. And influencers are so important, even artists and media people, but definitely community leaders. It's always the trusted voices. So if we can help those people understand how to communicate effectively with their constituents, with their the people in their communities, I think that's the solution we should push for, because there's very limited people that will be affected if we're trying to pre-bunk disinformation, for instance, the work that you're doing. It's really important, but it's not going, that has to be taken to communities that, in a way, and the language that is used has to be for the people that can hear it. And the people who are angry about social injustices, real or perceived, are the ones that are very vulnerable, because what you're trying to do is create that us versus them. And it's really easy to sell a messaging about the evil them if you're feeling life isn't fair. It's unjust in my community. For my people, we're not getting our share. And so it's really easy to create that us and them, and that's the first step.
So the trusted voices, I totally agree with, but you're also saying that you got brought into the cult because you trusted someone, probably too much or completely. How do you sort of deal with that sort of aspect of putting too much trust in one particular leader, for example, or one particular, the Messiah, versus trusting people in your community? That's what's confusing me a little bit here.
Well, there's prevention, is what I was talking about with you. If we're talking education, that middle pillar of work, of educating the masses at a population level to help people not get taken advantage of in this way. Right. Then you use community leaders and such. Right. Once you're in an environment, and depending on, it's on a continuum. How much do you need this to be true? How much psychological pain are you in? How good does it feel to feel exceptionalism, to feel like I'm part of the special group that understands more than anyone else what's going on? If that, depending on how much you need it to be true, you can be weaponized at one extreme, or you might just find it kind of intriguing and use some of the thought-terminating cliches when you're in, it depends on how much you need it.
Right. And so you're talking about education here. Is pre-bunking essentially educating people on what to look out for, how to recognize certain techniques? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't mind. You know, I think to some extent, educating people can be perhaps the greatest inoculation in the larger scheme of things. But if you talk about it as a specific approach, I think it's quite different. So education is usually about teaching people broad facts or critical thinking, or you know, it's often non-specific to propaganda, and inoculation actually has a very specific format. So you have to, instead of giving people more facts or more science, which I think is also great, it's actually about giving people a weakened dose of what a psychological manipulator would do. And you can weaken that with humor or other examples, and then you actually deconstruct and refute it in advance so people can build up the specific quote-unquote antibodies they need to spot and neutralize it. So it includes forewarning people, because our psychological sort of immune system is sleeping most of the time, and so people need to be aware of their own vulnerability to being misled, because a lot of people think they're not vulnerable. They're smart people. They're not going to fall prey to some crazy conspiracy, right? And so that, you know, that's part of it. And then you need to give people the weakened dose and refute it. And that format is actually not the way it's usually done in media literacy and education. So when we say pre-bunking, what I'm trying to say is that you know, Finland is one of the exceptions where, because they share a 800-mile border with Russia, they're keenly aware of the dangers of propaganda, and so they've been educating young kids on how to spot propaganda specifically from a very early age. And so I think we need to get much more specific in order for it to really fit with pre-bunking. But I agree that, you know, the limitations of this approach are that, you know, some of the ways that we've tried to get this out there are through fun games where, you know, and this, I think John Rosenbeek is in the room, was, you know, attributed to, he was like, well, you know, people are not going to listen if it's going to be some boring media literacy lecture, and, you know, we don't want to come off as some elitist institution telling people what they need to believe, so we need to make it non-political, make sure that people are going to be receptive to it, and it's kind of an edgy game. I mean, you step into the shoes of a manipulator, and, you know, you can pick any side. The narrator tells you, oh, it doesn't matter, right? The idea is to drive people apart, and it kind of went viral on Reddit and like the internet, you know, community, and when we scraped people's comments to see what they liked about it, you get sort of the responses like, you know, a lot of people are radicalized when they game online, right? So there's chat functions and so on, and so the people who were writing about it were like, oh, it's kind of like practicing in the character of your opponent, so you can learn their tactics, and they were, you know, it was a way for them to understand what this was about. But then again, not everyone wants to play a game, right? And so you need to reach people. And I fully agree with the trusted messenger. One of the things that we've learned is, like, when you do something like this with, you know, I don't know, the WHO or the UN or a government, then all of a sudden, you know, the government's fake news, and, you know, this time you like the government, and so it's okay, but the next time you have a different government, you don't like that government. And so, you know, you need trusted actors to deliver this stuff. And I think that is, right, whether it's influencers or community leaders, so I absolutely agree that is the way to have more specificity in how you inject this approach into the educational curriculum, I think. Yeah.
I would just like to add is that one project I'm really excited about that we're doing is called the Stories Bank. Mm-hmm. And we want to interview hundreds of former people who were psychologically manipulated. I hate to use the word radicalized, because not everybody has been fully radicalized. That's voice can be valuable. But if someone feels like, oh, that person is like me, and they went through this, and I don't want to go through that, or I can see that I trust that person's story. And so the stories of people who have been through this and come out the other end are so important. And I think if we have a bank of these stories that have given permission to use for educational purposes, then excerpts from their stories can be used to help community leaders and such talk to the people that they care about this threat.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We're going to open up very shortly to the audience for questions, but I really did want to ask you, Sander, from a psychological point of view. I love the parallels you have with medicine, both of you, and vaccines and inoculation as a physician. But I'd really like to understand if you could describe this from a psychological process. What do you mean exactly by a weakened dosage, and how does that affect the mind?
Yeah. So, so inoculation theory, it does use a bit of the medical language, so I have to come back to this. But the idea really is that just as the body needs lots of copies, or the immune system needs lots of copies of potential invaders in order to mount an effective immune response and to differentiate it from, healthy cells, and it needs to know what it looks like. It kind of works the same with the brain. So people often don't have the right mental defenses in place. So to give you an example, not to hopefully dupe anyone in this room, but a lot of people, and this is a classic anti-vax argument, a lot of people don't have mental defenses in place to counter-argue against what I'm about to tell you, which is that a lot of childhood vaccines don't use randomized placebo-controlled trials. And for a lot of people, that's shocking news, because they don't really understand, maybe as a physician, you're keenly aware of why that is. I mean, there have been plenty of randomized placebo trials, but some of them are not conducted because it's not ethical. So when lives are at stake and you have a vaccine that works, it's not considered ethical to not give the control group the vaccine. Usually they use an active other type of vaccine and not a baseline control group. But they will use this to say that there's no baseline safety data on some of the childhood vaccines, right? So the weakened dose here is not to give people this specific myth, but to practice an example of what the rhetorical fallacy here is. And so you might say, oh, I thought I was being deplatformed here. And it's like, that's enough on the vaccine stuff. And so you might say, let's trial a new parachute. I like this group. I'm going to give them the new fancy parachute, very protective. This other group that's going to fall out of the plane, you're going to get a placebo parachute. Right? And then it becomes very clear to people that that is not an ethical thing to do. And that is the weakened dose that you would, that's an example of how you would use a weakened dose to try to elucidate the manipulation technique in kind of a safe way to then allow people to build up the resistance. And then we test people with the actual examples later on, and they can see the same sort of structure. I can give you another quick example, which is the false dilemma one, which is used a lot on places like YouTube to recruit people into extremist, ways of thinking, and colleagues like Steve Lewandowski have done research on this, which is, either you join ISIS or you're not a good Muslim. That's an example of a false dilemma, right? They pretend there's only two. They take away all nuance to make it more extreme. And what we found is that, how do you inoculate people against that using a weakened dose? We don't really want to talk about ISIS, right? That's maybe not, that's maybe too close, but we give people a clip from Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith. I don't know if people here are Star Wars fan, but you have Anakin Skywalker, who later becomes Darth Vader, talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he says, either you're with me or you're my enemy, and then Obi-Wan says, only a Sith deals in absolutes, right? And then the narrator kind of explains, you don't want to be a Sith, don't use these manipulation techniques. And then we test people with the actual examples, right? And then we find people become more immune to them. Now, the real clever observer would notice that only a Sith deals in absolutes is also an absolute statement. But we don't hear that many commentary. But coming back to actually the trust thing, when we did focus groups on this with technology companies, so John Rosenbeek, he comes up with these popular culture references because, we have similar, early 80s, 90s background, but so we were testing this amongst Gen Z and millennials, and they were like, South Park, Star Wars, Family Guy, this must be for old people. And so, I think it does matter how you target these things.
Very good.
I was just wondering, do you in my opinion about this, that the stories of former members or former people that have been taken advantage of, either a little bit or a lot. Would that be considered a small dose? Like,
yeah, absolutely. You can use that as a small dose. I think it's brilliant. I use it a lot in my personal life. So
I would think so. I think that's what I have found works best.
Yeah.
That's what people hear the most because they see themselves in that.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's absolutely right. A former conspiracy theorist, for example, who are now trying to I agree with you, not everyone is fully radicalized, but they're trying to, I think deprogramming is also a bit of a tricky word, and so, but it's, very much in that spirit. So, for example, what I often use in my work with conspiracies is the Alex Jones example. So I have a close family member who's been a conspiracy theorist our whole lives. He's a diehard 9/11 truther, became very extreme during the pandemic, took his kids out of school, thinks the state is pursuing him with vaccine passports, and he's totally gone off the rails. But whenever I argue with him, debunking doesn't work. We're not going to talk about facts. I talk about Alex Jones. Look, this guy has been lying to people about Sandy Hook for years, and now he's admitting that, in fact, they weren't crisis actors, right? He's making lots of money off of this. Don't you think it's possible that people try to manipulate you and that conspiracy theories are actually ways to control people rather than being a real, truther? And I think that gets more traction because then they're like, they don't like to be manipulated because, right? And so that gets more traction than trying to argue over specific facts.
Yeah. That is what we teach families to do. We have trainings for family members or loved ones, and we teach them what is psychological manipulation, how does it work, how can you bring this up in a way that is not, that you're not getting in a fight with them.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that actually they can see could help them and possibly be true, that maybe they are being taken advantage of. People who use these tactics either want power, money, or influence. Those are the things that they want, and that's an easy thing to talk to people about because that's something people are familiar with, are cons. And isn't it possible that this could be happening in this way, and using the internet and using social media to create these information silos? So that kind of a discussion is people will be more open to.
Yeah, absolutely. And given the parallels with the business school community, I often explain it as a multi-level marketing scheme where the people at the top who want power and influence are concocting these things, people in the middle are duped into spreading them, and people on the bottom are suffering the consequences.
Yeah.
Excellent. I would like to turn over to the audience now, if we have any questions from the audience. We have someone at the back.
Dr. Claire Lee, lecturing financial accounting from Royal Holloway, University of London. Thank you very much for your sharing from a different perspective, from a psychological perspective. My question is that, would you like to share some examples or cases relating to the financial issues at the individual level, family level, or a more broad level? And how is the disinformation like in these financial situations? Thank you very much.
Did you understand the question? Could you just repeat the last bit of that question, please?
So how is disinformation like in these financial issues, the situations?
Maybe my interpretation is, what are the economic drivers of disinformation?
I think there's a lot of money to be made. I think there's a lot of people who see this as an opportunist. So if you take, for instance, what's going on in the United States, there's in the QAnon type of environment, there's a lot of people that hop on board to make money. And there's a lot of money to be made on for instance, saying that COVID is not real. There's a lot of money made on healthcare products a lot of them are scams. But if you can create fear in people, which is what the goal is, create fear, create the other, and sell your products to them. So there's a lot of money, I think, to be made on controlling people's decision-making processes, controlling how they see the world. You can sell a lot of products and make a lot of money that way. Lots of opportunists take that advantage.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, there's whole industries that revolve around disinformation. I mean, to some extent, the anti-vax industry, but also climate denial. I mean, oil companies have made huge amounts of money off of, you know, to some extent, duping people on this issue. I mean, the tobacco industry was obviously heavily invested in keeping people to buy cigarettes, right, and denying the health consequences of smoking. So to some extent, I think it is a money-oriented motive. I think political, there's a whole other side to it that is political, I think, but sometimes the two go in hand. And I don't know if people know this, but in the U.S., the Supreme, or no, it wasn't a Supreme Court, I think it was actually a local court who ordered the tobacco industry to admit that they've conspired and manipulated the public for decades, and that they now need to run corrective ads, that they've lied, and that smoking is dangerous for your health. But my question is, who's going to see these corrective ads now after 20 years of disinformation, 50 years, I should say, of disinformation? And that's the challenge that we're in with a lot of this disinformation. It's powered by financial vested interest.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that example is such an important one, because that just shows how important a public health approach is. I mean, what worked for tobacco, now you can't smoke in airplanes, you can't smoke in public places, there's policy around it. Most people, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that doesn't understand that tobacco causes cancer.
Right, yeah.
You know, so a public health approach is what we need to psychological manipulation.
It took an awful long time, though, right? Which is, we want to tackle those things earlier.
Yeah, we got to hurry up.
The approach was so sophisticated, as you mentioned, with the fake experts and really selling doubt is what they sold doubt as their product. Is it really true that smoking causes cancer? Could it not be all these other things that? So we do want to get there a little bit faster than that, but I think it's a good example. Any further questions?
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I'm Caroline Scarton from the University of Sheffield. Related to this last discussion, but also to the panel title, I was wondering whether one of the reasons of the effectiveness of disinformation is because there isn't really accountability for people that disseminate it or create these stories. So, of course, you gave the example of the tobacco industry and also the BBC, New York Times, but an apology is not really a strong consequence of all the harms that were caused. So I'd like to know your opinion about increasing the accountability and potential penalties for actors doing that in large scale.
That's a great question. Who should be accountable and who's actually responsible?
Yeah. You want to go? Okay, I'll go. I'll give it a quick. You know, I do think. I mean, as a psychologist, I mean, we obviously have the bias on working on psychological questions, and you were asking, you know, what makes, you know, what's the psychology behind it? And I think at the individual level, it's that a lot of people haven't necessarily thought about being manipulated, what it looks like, and considering their own vulnerability. And right, so there's a lot we can do at the individual level, but I think it's really important for that not to undermine the systematic level changes that we need to change the incentives and to hold actors accountable who are spreading some of the disinformation. Because you know, most of the time it's not regular people who are spreading the disinformation. It's often elites or I don't want to say influencers, but people in positions of power who are spreading some of this disinformation, and whether it's you know a government or the tobacco industry or another actor, and we need to hold them accountable. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about social media companies as well, so you know, I'll reserve that for later, but I think we need to change the incentives in the system that lead to different kinds of both consequences for spreading disinformation, but also the types of content that is being actively rewarded and promoted. I think at the moment we're seeing too many incentives that reward the sort of, you know, outrage, division, extremism, and that's part of the way the information sharing system has been set up, and partly, how the algorithms feed into that. But then also, as you said, there are no real consequences often for people spreading disinformation, and I think we're heading in the wrong direction. I mean, in the United States, the Biden administration is being sued for funding misinformation research. Colleagues from the States couldn't make it because this is about disinformation. It's become so politicized that it's a free speech issue now. And so actually doing anything about the consequences of disinformation is being actively stifled because it's become so polarized. And a pessimistic view would be that's because the people who are spreading the disinformation are finding it useful and perceiving it as a threat that anything is to be done about it.
Yeah, I do think that once we define the problem as manipulative tactics, and we're looking for how that is being perpetuated through technology, then we can look for those tactics and educate people about it. But we do need policy around it. Or is it possible to create policy around it? That's a big challenge, but that is the challenge that we have to work on, is defining what is the harm that's being done, how is it being done, and how can we put guardrails around it. That's a big problem that I hope people in this room are working really hard on.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Keith Kiley. I'm with the Bulgarian-Romanian Observatory on Digital Media and Sofia University. Thank you guys for the great panel, and thanks to Sander for highlighting that the Jedi are a cult. In terms of, you've all touched on lack of trust in institutions, and I'm wondering how much you guys see that as a key point, because disinformation and lack of trust in institutions is often conflated as being one phenomenon. We know that that's rather an avenue, lack of trust in institution, which has existed for a long time, which disinformation uses emotive reactions then based on years of experience with failed political institutions, financial institutions, parties, etc., can be used to generate support behind the disinformation narrative. So I'm wondering what the panel would say in terms of, it's an extremely complicated question, obviously, but is it something that we could consider as a solution, as building into our solutions, is looking at how our institutions, how our social, political, and economic institutions function, and tackling that aspect? Otherwise, aren't we going to see narrative escalation, right? So if we rely specifically on counter-narratives, that will lead to escalation. Shouldn't we maybe look at the structural problems which lead to disinformation, which produce information, which lead to distrust in institutions, and tackle those?
So I think what you're talking about here is in a way pre-bunking, but in a larger scale to help people understand that a tactic that will be used to try to control people's behavior and decision-making processes is they'll try to convince you to not trust major institutions. And also, it's important to say that major institutions have problems. There is corruption in government. There's corruption in everything. Not to deny that and say that these institutions are perfect, but to point out the fact that creating mistrust in information in these institutions is a tactic that is aimed at you to harm you. And people will be motivated to protect themselves from this type of manipulation if they can see what it is and understand that that's a tactic. And it's harder to grapple with complexity than it is to have easy answers fed to you. And so it feels safe and nice in these information silos. But if you start to believe that this messaging of not trusting institutions is meant to take away your agency and your autonomy, then I think that's a good way to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it's a hugely complex question. I mean, I agree that, low societal trust is a key ingredient in what allows disinformation to spread and take hold. And obviously, trust in our social political systems is a much, much bigger issue that needs to be tackled. You know, I don't want to speak too much outside of my expertise in terms of you know, the social political changes that need to happen in order to maintain trust. I mean, if you look at the polls, I mean, broadly people do trust scientists. Doctors are still one of the most trusted experts. There are minorities of people who severely distrust some of these actors, which is a problem, and I'm sure that's related to structural inequalities and other, I think, phenomena that we need to tackle, polarization. What I will say, bringing it back to my own expertise, is when we do research on trust, you know, what you find psychologically, it's a very asymmetric process. So it takes years to build and foster trust, but you can lose it in a second. And so what you want to do with your communications, and we've done some research on this, and this is what we advise governments and others to do, is to follow some principles about being transparent, about whether you're informing or wanting to persuade people, what are the motives behind what you're communicating, so people don't misinterpret your intentions, to be open actually about uncertainty, otherwise people will weaponize it later. When you say that something, or imply that it's certain and then change course, we know from research people really don't like that. So we saw during the pandemic, if you say one thing and then it turns out to be another, people think they're conspiracies, they're filling in the vacuum, they're claiming that there is a lot of uncertainty and you pretended that the science was certain. So actually being open about scientific uncertainty and getting people to understand what that means, pre-bunking, talking about the quality of evidence and helping people calibrate, you know, what are different levels of evidence, how should we understand what different types of evidence are, and, you know, actually trying to offer some balance, but not false balance. And so, you know, when there's a clear scientific consensus, we need to communicate that. But when there are multiple sides to an issue, you want to highlight that. And often actors who try to persuade people don't do that deliberately because they have a policy goal and they want to persuade people towards that policy goal, which is fine as long, I think, as you're transparent about that. In fact, the research on nudging, which has become very somewhat controversial now, and I think it's being politicized because it's perceived as being covert and you know, secret government nudging. But the research actually shows if you're transparent about wanting to nudge people, it works just as well. And so I think, you know, for our communication, if it follows some of these guidelines, I think it should help foster trust in evidence and in science, and that's kind of what we've been experimenting with, but obviously it's just a very small part of the solution.
Right. And justified trust, that's what we want, justified trust in institutions, so they need to prove that they're trustworthy and maintain that trust. But I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much to both the panelists. I've really enjoyed this conversation.